Ernesto Che Guevara's first memory of injustice was etched not in a battlefield or a revolution, but in the quiet despair of a small Argentine village he passed through on a motorcycle trip with his friend Alberto. He was 19, lean and restless, the wind slicing across his face, carrying the scent of wet earth and the faint tang of smoke from distant chimneys. He had read about poverty in textbooks and seen statistics in newspapers, but nothing had prepared him for the raw human suffering he would witness on the winding roads of Latin America. A boy no older than 10, crouched outside a crumbling adobe house, trying to coax a meal from a handful of dry grains. His mother lay inside, feverish and unmoving, her lips pale, her breathing shallow. Che had stopped instinctively, his fingers itching to help, his chest tightening with helplessness. The villagers told him the boy's father had abandoned them, that the government had done nothing, that they were invisible in the eyes of those who held power. And in that moment, Che felt something awaken deep inside him, a fire that refused to be extinguished. It was more than anger, it was a raw, aching empathy that left him sleepless at night. He wrote in his journal, words spilling with urgency, "How many lives will we let slip through our hands before we act? How long will injustice rule the land while men like me ride past, indifferent?" The questions haunted him as he pressed on through the mountains, deserts, and rivers, each new town and village exposing him to another fragment of human suffering: cholera, famine, destitution, and a despair that clung to the people like a second skin. By the time Che reached the mining towns in Bolivia, he had begun to see patterns in the pain. It was not random misfortune that left so many hungry and sick. It was a system built to preserve the wealth and comfort of a few while condemning millions to silent misery. Each injustice he observed was a spark, each broken face a matchstick. And in the dark of the Andean nights, beneath the trembling constellations, Che began to imagine a world reshaped, not by governments or treaties, but by men and women who would dare to seize it with courage and conviction. But passion alone was not enough. Che was not naive. He had seen revolutions before, read their histories, and known that good intentions often ended in blood. He remembered the Cuban poet Martí and the tales of the failed uprisings against colonial powers. And yet, he felt an unshakable certainty. If not now, then when? If not him, then who? His body tensed as he scribbled fervently in his journal, the words blurring with tears, "I will not be a spectator in a world of suffering." The journey transformed him. The boy who once imagined himself as a doctor, quietly healing the sick, became a man with a vision of radical change. He no longer simply wanted to understand the world, he wanted to remake it. His eyes burned with a new light, the kind that frightened people who had known him as a shy, reflective youth. But for Che, fear was merely a companion, never a guide. The thrill of purpose coursed through him like a river, carrying him toward something larger, something dangerous, something that could not be undone once begun. It was during a dusty evening in the city of Córdoba that he first met men who spoke the same language of rebellion, though not yet of concrete plans. They spoke of governments that cheated, of armies that killed indiscriminately, of peasants crushed under the weight of the powerful. Che listened, nodding, absorbing, each story feeding the hunger inside him. And in their words, he glimpsed a truth that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Revolutions are not born from desire alone. They are forged in the crucible of human suffering, tempered with sacrifice, and fueled by the courage to act when all else fails. Yet even in these moments of clarity, Che sensed an undercurrent he could not ignore, a tension between idealism and pragmatism, between the fire of moral certainty and the cold calculations of power. In his heart, he knew that once he embarked on this path, there would be no turning back. Friends might betray him, allies might falter, and even those closest to him could one day stand on the opposite side of the barricade. And still, he pressed on, driven by the conviction that the world could be more than a place of suffering and silence. On the last night before leaving Argentina for Mexico, he sat alone in the small room he had rented for weeks, the city noises fading into the distance like a half-remembered dream. He traced the lines of his journal with trembling fingers, reading over the words that now seemed to belong to someone else, someone he had yet to fully become. "I will dedicate my life to the fight for justice," he wrote, "even if it costs everything, even if I must face those I once called brother." Outside, the wind carried the faint smell of smoke and wet earth, familiar and comforting yet distant. Che closed the journal and looked toward the horizon, the sky bleeding into shades of indigo and orange. He did not yet know the battles that awaited him, nor the friends he would come to love and lose. But he knew one thing: the fire had been lit and nothing, not fear, not doubt, not betrayal, would extinguish it. The revolution had not yet begun, but its first spark was alive in him, burning brighter than any star in the night sky. And so, with a heart both heavy and exhilarated, Ernesto Che Guevara stepped onto the road that would change not only his life but the course of history itself. Mexico City in the early 1950s was a city of contrasts: opulence and poverty, music and silence, laughter and whispers of fear. Ernesto Che Guevara arrived there with little more than a tattered suitcase, a notebook bursting with observations, and a heart still smoldering with the flames of injustice he had seen across Latin America. He had heard of a man who, like him, dreamed of freeing Cuba from the yoke of dictatorship, a man named Fidel Castro. But names alone carried no weight. Che was driven by a need to see ideals in flesh and bone, to test their fire in the crucible of real people. Their first meeting was unremarkable in outward appearances. A dimly lit room, the hum of a ceiling fan, the faint smell of tobacco and coffee. Che arrived with caution, his tall frame stooped slightly from travel, his dark eyes scanning every shadow, every movement. And then he saw him, Fidel, energetic, magnetic, almost overwhelming in presence. His eyes were alive with a fervor that mirrored Che's own, his gestures bold and unhesitating, as if the world itself were waiting for his command. They spoke cautiously at first, exchanging ideas in careful sentences, testing the waters of intellect and ideology. But as the conversation deepened, walls fell away. They debated strategy and theory, poverty and justice, morality and necessity. Che listened with intensity, nodding, absorbing, challenging where he disagreed, all the while aware of a strange resonance. A feeling that he had finally found someone who could see the world as he did, who could feel the weight of its suffering as sharply as he did. Fidel's vision was intoxicating. He spoke of Cuba not as it was, but as it could be, liberated, sovereign, a beacon of hope to all oppressed peoples. And Che, who had spent years wandering the continent, had never felt such certainty before. It was as if the world had whispered to him, and in Fidel, he had found an answer. Brotherhood was forged in that room, not of blood but of shared fire, a covenant made silently between two men who had glimpsed the same impossible horizon. Yet even in their laughter and shared conviction, Che could sense subtle differences that would later shape the trajectory of their alliance. Where Che's idealism burned fiercely but often in private reflection, Fidel's ambition was bold, almost theatrical, a hunger that could command loyalty but also consume those around him. Che noted these nuances quietly, the glint in Fidel's eye when speaking of leadership, the way his hands moved insistently, as if shaping not just plans but people themselves. Suspicion was not yet fear, but it lingered like a shadow at the edge of trust. Late at night, after long discussions over maps and hastily drawn battle plans, Che would sit alone on the rooftop of his rented room, gazing at the city lights that flickered like distant stars. He could still hear Fidel's voice echoing in his mind, bold and unwavering, promising revolution. And yet, the questions began to stir in him. Power can corrupt even the noblest cause. Can one man bear the weight of an entire revolution without bending? Will brotherhood survive when ambition strains its bonds? In those first weeks, they recruited others, like-minded men and women drawn to the audacity of their vision. Che admired Fidel's ability to inspire loyalty, to move hearts with a single sentence or a determined gesture. But admiration was tinged with unease. Che had learned through his journeys that revolutions are more than battles. They are tests of character, morality, and endurance. One misstep, one betrayal could unravel everything. And Fidel, for all his charisma, seemed almost untouchable in his confidence, a force of nature that Che respected and feared. Despite the tension, a deep camaraderie took root. They shared meals of black beans and tortillas, often sitting in silence, letting ideas ferment between bites. They shared cigarettes and laughter, sometimes mocking their own seriousness, yet always returning to the weighty matters at hand: who would lead, how to fight, and what the world might become if they succeeded. In those quiet interludes, Che glimpsed the man behind the legend, a brother in arms, a comrade in conviction, a man whose heart could ignite a continent if wielded wisely. But the shadows never fully lifted. Che began to notice small things: a sudden sharpness in Fidel's tone when challenged, a flicker of impatience when plans diverged from his vision. Suspicion was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet persistent. In the early days, it was easy to dismiss as passion. Later, Che would recognize it as the first warning of a storm to come. Revolution, he realized, was not only a battle against an external enemy but a delicate dance with those closest to you. One evening, as they pored over maps of the Sierra Maestra mountains, plotting routes and guerrilla tactics, Fidel paused and looked at Che with an intensity that made the younger man shift uncomfortably. "We will need absolute trust," Fidel said, voice low but firm. No hesitation. No second guessing. Our enemies are not only outside these walls, they are everywhere, even among those we call friends. Che nodded, understanding the unspoken warning. Trust, he realized, would be both their greatest weapon and their most fragile bond. He felt a thrill, a shiver of anticipation, and a twinge of fear. This was no ordinary alliance. This was the start of a journey where loyalty, ideology, and survival would be tested in ways neither of them could yet imagine. By the time Che left the rooftop that night, the city sprawled below him like a labyrinth of possibilities. He felt an electric certainty. He had found a brother, a comrade, a kindred spirit, but also a challenge, a mirror of his own ambitions and vulnerabilities. Together they would light the fuse of revolution. Together they would face victories and betrayals yet unspoken. And somewhere deep in the marrow of his being, Che understood that the bond they had forged would be tested not by the enemy outside Cuba, but by the ideals, ambition, and fears that dwelled within them both. The boat rocked gently under the moonlight, slicing silently through the Gulf of Mexico toward a land that promised both hope and danger. Ernesto Che Guevara huddled with a small group of revolutionaries, their faces drawn and tense, their eyes reflecting the phosphorescent shimmer of the water. The air was thick with salt and anticipation, and the faint creak of wooden planks beneath their weight punctuated the tense silence. Che's heart pounded, not with fear, but with the electric certainty that history was about to be written with their hands, their courage, and their blood. Cuba rose ahead like a dark silhouette, mountains jagged against the star-streaked sky. It was not the glamorous Havana of postcards, but the wild, untamed terrain of the Sierra Maestra, rugged and difficult, a refuge for those brave, or desperate, enough to risk everything. Che inhaled sharply, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. He was not just a soldier. He was an idealist carrying the hopes of a continent, a witness to injustice who had vowed to act. And now, action was unavoidable. The landing was chaotic. Small skiffs ferried them to shore under cover of night, their movements masked by shadows. Batista's patrols were rumored to be everywhere, their eyes trained for intruders, their guns ready to punish any who dared challenge their regime. Every splash of water against the hull, every whisper of movement, sent tension shooting through Che's body. He felt the familiar fire of purpose, but it mingled with a sharp edge of fear. Real fear, the kind that burns through nerves and sharpens senses. Once ashore, the group slipped into the jungle, branches tearing at clothing, insects biting at exposed skin, the scent of wet earth and decaying leaves filling their lungs. Che led at the front, eyes scanning constantly, muscles coiled for sudden action. They moved with the practiced silence of men who had rehearsed for months, yet nothing could fully prepare them for the raw, unforgiving reality of guerrilla warfare. Every shadow could conceal an enemy, every rustle could herald death. And in the back of his mind, a whisper of doubt lingered. Even among friends, even among those sworn to the cause, loyalty can fracture when survival is at stake. The first confrontation came sooner than expected. Batista's troops, alerted by local informants, ambushed a small group sent ahead to scout. Gunfire shattered the night, bullets tearing through foliage and earth alike. Che dropped instinctively behind a fallen tree, heart hammering, palms slick with sweat. He returned fire with precision, every shot a dance between fear and resolve. Around him, comrades fell, some shouting, some silent, some frozen in disbelief. And through it all, Che felt an icy clarity. This was no longer theory, no longer idealistic musings written in journals. It was life and death, and every decision carried the weight of history. Fidel appeared suddenly beside him, shouting orders that cut through the chaos. Che followed, their coordination seamless, their bond forged not only in ideology but in the shared crucible of survival. Yet even in that frantic moment, Che noticed the subtle tension beneath Fidel's commands, a hunger for control, an insistence that every decision, every life, bent toward his vision. It was not criticism yet, not mistrust, but the seed of unease planted quietly amid the roar of gunfire. They survived the ambush, retreating deeper into the mountains where the terrain itself became their ally. Here, victory felt immediate and intoxicating. The oppressive forces of Batista's army could not navigate the thick jungles as deftly as the revolutionaries. Che watched as the men cheered quietly, relief and exhilaration mixing in sweat-soaked faces. He allowed himself a fleeting smile, a rare softness amid the tension. Yet even in celebration he felt the weight of loss, the bodies of the fallen, the dreams cut short, and the silent understanding that victory in one skirmish did not guarantee survival in the next. Days bled into nights, and the guerrilla camp became a crucible of human endurance. Men slept on the cold, damp ground, the heat of the day burned their skin, hunger gnawed at their bellies. Yet in this hardship, camaraderie flourished. Che and Fidel shared moments of quiet, whispering plans beneath the canopy, discussing strategy, and occasionally laughing at jokes that seemed absurd in their context but kept despair at bay. Brotherhood, Che realized, was being tested not only by the external enemy but by the pressures of leadership, loyalty, and survival. As weeks passed, victories came. Small towns liberated, supply lines disrupted, the growing support of local peasants drawn to their cause. Che reveled in these moments, but he also began to notice the friction beneath the surface. Some comrades questioned Fidel's uncompromising decisions, some whispered doubts about the ultimate cost of ambition. Che listened carefully, eyes narrowing not in judgment but in observation. Suspicion was not yet fear, but it lingered, a subtle reminder that the line between comrade and rival could blur when ideology collided with human ambition. One evening, as the sun dipped below the jagged horizon, casting the jungle in gold and shadow, Che and Fidel stood side by side, surveying a valley they had secured. Che felt a strange mixture of exhilaration and foreboding. They had won battles, gained ground, and inspired hope. And yet he could not shake the whisper in his mind: power is intoxicating. Friendship is fragile. Ideals can be betrayed by those who once shared them. He turned to Fidel, searching the face of the man who had become both brother and commander. There was pride there, yes, and confidence, but also a shadow he could not name. Che clenched his fists, feeling the weight of what was to come, the inevitability of choices yet to be made, and the knowledge that the revolution, while external, was also an internal struggle, a test of loyalty, morality, and the human heart itself. And so, in the silent, humid darkness of the Sierra Maestra, Ernesto Che Guevara took a breath, steadying himself for the battles ahead. The revolution had begun in earnest, its first fires ignited by blood, courage, and conviction. But even in the euphoria of victory, the shadow of doubt lingered, and Che understood. The greatest challenges might not come from the enemy outside, but from the fragile, complex, and sometimes dangerous bonds within. Havana awoke to a new dawn, but it was unlike any dawn Che Guevara had ever witnessed. The city, once heavy with fear and oppression, now trembled with cautious hope. Word had spread that Batista had fled, that the revolutionaries had taken control, and that the long nightmare of dictatorship had ended. Che stood atop a modest rooftop, the Caribbean sun cutting through the morning haze, and felt a rush of exhilaration that almost took his breath away. Years of wandering, fighting, and risking everything had led to this moment. The revolution had won. The streets below were alive with the hum of celebration. People poured from their homes, waving flags, singing songs of freedom, and embracing one another as if the mere act of survival had become a victory in itself. Che descended into the city, walking among the throngs, absorbing the raw emotion of a people liberated, yet still cautious, still scarred. Every handshake, every tearful smile, every shout of joy carved itself into his memory. He felt as if the world had shifted beneath his feet, as if the impossible had finally become real. Fidel appeared beside him as they moved through the cheering crowds, his presence magnetic, commanding, almost regal. The two men, once strangers united by a shared vision, now stood at the apex of a historic triumph. Che felt a surge of pride, but it was tinged with a shadow of unease, a subtle awareness that victory could bring its own dangers. Power, he knew, was intoxicating, and even the purest intentions could be warped by ambition. In private moments they discussed the future. Cuba needed rebuilding, direction, leadership. Che's mind raced with ideas for social reform, land redistribution, and the empowerment of the peasants he had come to know so intimately. Fidel, however, spoke with a focus on consolidation, the necessity of loyalty, and the discipline required to maintain control. It was a practical approach, undeniably effective, but Che felt a tension rising between idealism and pragmatism, a tension that would grow in the months to come. The celebrations were not without cost. Che noticed the absence of some comrades, lost in the fighting or captured or broken by fear. He touched their names in memory as he walked, feeling both pride in their sacrifices and a quiet sorrow for the lives cut short. Victory, he realized, was not purely joyous. It was layered with grief, a bittersweet mix of triumph and tragedy. The revolution had given them freedom, yes, but it had demanded blood, loyalty, and courage at every turn. Amid the jubilation, small fractures began to appear. Some local leaders questioned Fidel's methods, whispering doubts about centralization of power. Che listened, silent and observant, noting the subtle signs of tension that hinted at future struggles. Fidel, he realized, was brilliant, charismatic, and relentless, but also increasingly exacting. In the private corners of his mind, Che felt a flicker of worry. Would loyalty hold when ideals clashed with authority? Could the bonds of brotherhood survive the pressures of governance? Despite these undercurrents, the revolutionaries allowed themselves moments of humanity. Che shared meals with comrades, breaking bread in kitchens lit by the warm glow of lanterns. He laughed, rare and unrestrained, and felt the comfort of friendship that had been forged in the fires of combat. And yet, even in these moments, he noticed the subtle differences in demeanor, the ways decisions were made, the quiet calculations that underlay gestures of camaraderie. Suspicion was not overt, but it lingered like a shadow at the edge of light, a reminder that victory alone did not ensure harmony. Che and Fidel met with intellectuals, workers, and students, discussing the new Cuba, sharing visions for education, health, and social reform. Che's idealism shone in these conversations, inspiring hope and excitement. But he could sense the careful pragmatism in Fidel's responses, a measured approach that prioritized survival and order over pure ideology. It was necessary, perhaps, yet it left Che uneasy, aware that even victories could contain the seeds of future discord. One evening, as the sun dipped low over Havana's rooftops, casting long shadows across the streets, Che and Fidel stood in silence, surveying the city they had fought to liberate. The air was thick with heat and anticipation, filled with the sounds of celebration fading into the evening. Che felt a complex surge of emotions: pride, exhilaration, sorrow, and a faint whisper of unease. The revolution had succeeded, yet the path ahead was uncertain, fraught with the subtle dangers of human ambition and the compromises of power. In that quiet moment, Che reflected on the journey that had brought them here, from the mountains of Mexico, through the treacherous jungles of Cuba, to the streets of a liberated Havana. He thought of the boy in the Argentine village, the faces of the oppressed, the sacrifices of comrades, and the fire that had been kindled within him so many years ago. It had grown into a roaring blaze, illuminating the path forward, yet also casting long dark shadows where doubt and tension might dwell. Victory, Che realized, was not an end point, it was a crucible, a test of character, loyalty, and ideals. Fidel's ambition was now inseparable from the revolution itself, a force both vital and dangerous. Che's heart swelled with pride at their accomplishments, yet it ached with the knowledge that the truest battles were yet to come, not against the forces of Batista, but within the hearts and minds of those who held power and those who followed ideals. As night fell over Havana, Che returned to a small room, removed the dust and sweat of the day, and sat with a journal open on his lap. He wrote, capturing the exhilaration of victory, the sorrow for the fallen, and the tension that now threaded through every victory. We have won battles, but the war is not yet over. Loyalty is fragile, ambition is relentless, and the revolution is only as strong as the ideals that guide it. He looked out the window at the moonlit streets, alive with celebration, and allowed himself a moment of rare vulnerability, a quiet smile, a deep breath, a recognition that for now hope had triumphed. But beneath the joy, a subtle awareness persisted. The revolution had succeeded, yet the bonds of brotherhood and the purity of ideology would soon face tests harsher than any battlefield. And Che knew, with the certainty that had guided him from the start, that he must be ready for what lay ahead, whatever it might demand. The air in Havana was thick with heat and expectation, but Ernesto Che Guevara felt an invisible weight pressing down on his shoulders. The city was free, the revolution triumphant, and yet, for all the celebrations and speeches, Che sensed that the real struggle had only just begun. Ideals, he realized, were not forged in victory alone. They were tested in the messy, fragile world of governance, where decisions bore consequences and compromises became unavoidable. Che spent his mornings in the offices of the new revolutionary government, reviewing reports of social programs, agricultural initiatives, and the redistribution of land. He listened as bureaucrats, once supporters of the revolution, now argued over budgets, priorities, and policies. The air was electric with ambition, but it was also heavy with hesitation and self-interest. Each conversation was a reminder that the lofty dreams of equality and justice could be strangled by the very hands that promised to protect them. Fidel was there too, commanding meetings with an intensity that bordered on obsession. He spoke of loyalty, discipline, and the absolute necessity of centralized authority to protect the fragile new order. Che admired Fidel's brilliance and unwavering focus, yet he could not ignore the subtle rigidity creeping into every decision. It was as if the man he had trusted as a comrade was slowly becoming a commander, a force shaping not only the revolution but the minds of those around him, bending them to fit a singular vision. Che's idealism clashed quietly, yet persistently, with the practicalities of power. He wanted to empower peasants to manage land collectively, to educate communities to govern themselves, to create a system where justice was tangible and immediate. But every proposal met resistance, not just from cautious bureaucrats but from those closest to him. Fidel, though supportive of the broader vision, urged caution, warning that too much autonomy could lead to chaos, betrayal, and vulnerability. Che understood the logic, yet each compromise felt like a betrayal of the principles that had carried them through the mountains, through bullets, and into Havana. The tension was not only structural but personal. Che watched as some comrades grew timid, others ambitious, and a few openly resentful. He had come to expect loyalty in the battlefield, where survival depended on unity, yet now loyalty seemed fragile, contingent upon orders, not ideals. He felt the strain acutely, recognizing that the revolution he had imagined, pure, egalitarian, righteous, was colliding with the messy human reality of politics and power. At night, Che walked alone through Havana, the streets quiet except for the distant hum of the city. He passed the vibrant markets, the crowded squares, the small homes where families were beginning to rebuild. He felt the heartbeat of a nation, raw and alive, yet he also sensed the shadows creeping into every corner, the unspoken compromises, the whispered doubts, the creeping authoritarianism that even Fidel seemed capable of. The ideals that had driven him across continents were now under siege, not by enemies outside, but by the very mechanisms of governance. He remembered the boy in Argentina, hungry and abandoned, and the peasants of Bolivia and Mexico, faces etched with suffering. Their plight had fueled his journey, had sharpened his convictions. And yet, here he was, surrounded by victory and struggling with a new kind of battle, the fight to preserve ideals in a world where survival, loyalty, and ambition often demanded compromise. Che felt a bitter pang of frustration and sorrow, knowing that this battle might be far harder than any skirmish in the Sierra Maestra. One evening, he met with Fidel privately, beneath the dim glow of a single lamp in a small office. The conversation was tense, unspoken words hanging like smoke between them. Che argued passionately for programs that empowered communities directly, insisting that true revolution meant enabling people to control their own destinies. Fidel, calm but insistent, countered with strategy, order, and the necessity of central authority. The clash was polite, almost cordial, yet each word carried weight, each glance hinted at the strain building between them. Che left the room with a hollow ache in his chest, feeling the first real fissures in the brotherhood that had carried them to victory. Even as he wrestled with these compromises, Che continued to act with integrity. He visited villages, spoke with farmers, and stayed in humble homes, absorbing the realities of the people they had freed. He wrote in his journal, capturing both triumphs and frustrations, the joys of seeing education and healthcare reach those who had never known either, and the despair at the resistance and apathy that still lingered. The revolution is not only about defeating enemies, but about defeating indifference, fear, and the temptation to settle for compromise over principle, he wrote. Yet, with each passing day, Che felt the tension with Fidel deepen. He noticed the subtle shifts, the impatience with debate, the expectation of unquestioned loyalty, the quiet intolerance for dissenting voices. Che could not help but question whether the ideals they had fought for were compatible with the realities of power. Would Fidel, the brother-in-arms he had trusted with his life, become a figure capable of bending the revolution to his will? And if so, where would that leave Che, the idealist who had once believed that victory itself would be enough? The nights grew long with reflection. Che would sit by a small window, listening to the distant sounds of Havana, the hum of voices, laughter, and music blending with the whisper of wind through palm fronds. He clenched his fists, felt the fire in his chest, and vowed silently, "I will not abandon these ideals. I will not let pragmatism and ambition destroy the soul of the revolution. Even if it costs everything, I will fight for the principles that brought me here." And so, Che realized that victory was no longer simply a matter of survival or strategy. The real battle had shifted inward, to the heart of the revolution itself. Ideals would have to contend with human ambition, brotherhood with authority, and morality with pragmatism. Che understood that the road ahead would be treacherous, filled with tests of loyalty, courage, and the very essence of his convictions. But for all the challenges, the fire within him burned brighter than ever. He would not falter, even if the revolution demanded a price that no one, not even Fidel, could anticipate. The air in Havana had grown heavy with expectation, but for Ernesto Che Guevara, it carried a different weight, a subtle, insidious tension that had begun to worm its way into every corner of the revolution. Victory had been achieved, Batista had fled, and the streets rang with celebration. But now the true challenge emerged, maintaining the fragile ideals that had inspired the fight, even as power, ambition, and pragmatism tugged at the bonds of brotherhood. Che began to notice it in small ways, a dismissive glance here, a quietly imposed order there, conversations that ended abruptly, leaving unspoken doubts hanging in the room like smoke. Fidel, brilliant and magnetic, had become even more commanding, his vision of the revolution absolute, his tolerance for debate shrinking. Che understood the necessity of strong leadership. He had seen the chaos of indecision, but he could not shake the growing unease that the revolution was beginning to take on a life of its own, one that might no longer align with the principles they had fought for. Whispers of dissent reached Che's ears. Some revolutionary leaders questioned Fidel's decisions, fearing the centralization of power, while others, hungry for influence, began maneuvering quietly, seeking advantage in the new hierarchy. Che listened, silent and observant, weighing each word carefully. Trust, he realized, was no longer automatic. It had to be earned and guarded, even among comrades who had bled and fought together. The bonds forged in the mountains now seemed fragile, strained by ambition and ideology. Che's own role became increasingly complicated. His vision of social reform, land redistribution, education for all, empowerment of local communities, clashed with Fidel's insistence on strict oversight and uniformity. Meetings grew tense. Discussions that had once been animated with camaraderie now ended with measured compliance or silent withdrawal. Che began to feel the strain of choosing between loyalty to a friend and loyalty to the ideals that had carried him across continents. The fractures were not confined to strategy alone, they seeped into personal interactions. Comrades who had once shared laughter and hardships now regarded each other with caution. Smiles were tighter, handshakes firmer, and conversations often ended with carefully measured words. Che noticed the subtle hierarchy forming, who spoke when, who deferred to whom, and who harbored private ambitions. In the privacy of his journal, he wrote of the unease gnawing at his spirit, a warning that the revolution could be undermined not only by enemies outside but by shadows within. One night, Che walked through the narrow streets of Havana, the city quiet except for the distant hum of voices celebrating what they had won. He thought of the men who had fallen in the mountains, the blood spilled for an ideal, and the sacrifices of countless peasants who had placed their trust in them. He felt a profound sorrow, a fear that those sacrifices might be rendered meaningless if the revolution lost its moral compass. In the shadows of the streets, he began to understand the truth he had long avoided. The most dangerous enemy might not be Batista or the remnants of the old regime, but the subtle erosion of trust, the creeping tension between loyalty and ambition, between friendship and ideology. Fidel, meanwhile, continued to assert his authority with a charisma that was nearly hypnotic. Meetings were dominated by his presence. Decisions were framed as inevitabilities rather than choices. Che admired his brilliance but could not ignore the authoritarian undertones. There were moments when he caught himself bristling at a tone or questioning a decision, a tiny spark of defiance, cautious but undeniable. He realized with a pang that these moments were the first visible fractures, subtle yet potentially fatal, in the brotherhood that had seemed unbreakable. The tension reached a turning point during a meeting about foreign alliances. Che advocated for a cautious, principled approach, wary of aligning too closely with powerful nations that might compromise Cuba's independence. Fidel, confident and insistent, argued for pragmatism and strategic advantage, warning that hesitation could leave the revolution vulnerable. Words were spoken with intensity, glances locked, and beneath the polite civility, a war of wills was quietly unfolding. Che left the room that evening with his jaw tight and his chest heavy, aware that their paths, once so aligned, were beginning to diverge. Even in moments of quiet, Che felt the fractures deepening. Comrades who had once been like brothers now eyed him with subtle caution, measuring his loyalty against the shifting tides of power. Every decision carried weight, every glance could conceal suspicion. The ideals that had inspired them all, justice, equality, freedom, were now at risk of compromise, reshaped by ambition, fear, and the subtle politics of survival. In the darkness of his quarters, Che stared at the faint glow of the city beyond the window. He thought of Fidel, of the man he had trusted with his life, and of the revolution that had consumed them both. He felt both sorrow and determination, sorrow for the cracks that were appearing, and determination that he would not allow the ideals they had fought for to be swallowed by ambition. The fractures were real, but they were also a test, a challenge that he would face with the same courage and clarity that had carried him across mountains and oceans. And so, Che made a silent vow, the revolution was larger than any one man, even Fidel. Its principles, its fire, and its promise to the people must be protected, even if the bonds of brotherhood strained or broke. The path ahead would be fraught with tension, betrayal, and impossible choices, but he would navigate it with unwavering resolve. For in the end, he understood that the revolution was not merely a conquest of territory, it was a conquest of conscience, morality, and the human heart itself. The Sierra Maestra mountains were a memory now, distant yet alive in Che Guevara's mind, a reminder of the crucible that had forged him. Victory in Cuba had brought elation and recognition, but it had also brought something he could not ignore: a growing tension between loyalty to a friend and fidelity to ideals. Ernesto Che Guevara had fought alongside Fidel Castro, trusted him with his life, and celebrated their shared triumph. But now the path ahead was becoming clearer and more perilous, and it was one he could not continue to follow blindly. Che had grown restless. Meetings in Havana felt like theaters of compromise, where ideals were negotiated and power subtly consolidated. Fidel's pragmatism, once admirable, now appeared as rigidity, a quiet insistence that the revolution bend to his vision alone. The subtle undercurrent of control was no longer invisible. It pressed upon every decision, every interaction, every choice Che made. The fire that had inspired him to travel continents, risk bullets, and endure hardship now clashed with the cold pragmatism shaping Cuba's future. It was during a late-night meeting with trusted comrades that Che felt the weight of his decision crystallize. The discussion was about Cuba's role on the global stage, about supporting revolutions abroad, and about aligning with nations whose values did not fully coincide with their own. Che argued passionately for principled action, for supporting freedom without compromising integrity. The room responded with polite nods, but the undercurrent of skepticism was undeniable. Fidel listened, eyes sharp, jaw firm, his authority implicit yet unmistakable. In that silence, Che understood that the revolution's direction was no longer guided solely by ideals. It was shaped by power, strategy, and control. He began to realize that staying in Cuba would demand a compromise he could not make. To remain loyal to Fidel was to accept a growing authoritarian streak, to witness decisions that, while strategically sound, betrayed the vision of justice and equality that had brought them together. Che's heart ached at the thought, for Fidel was more than a comrade. He was a brother in arms, a confidant, a man whose presence had defined his revolutionary journey. Yet, love and loyalty could not outweigh principle. If the revolution were to remain true, Che understood that he must step away. The decision was not made lightly. Che spent nights pacing the quiet streets of Havana, observing the city that had been liberated, feeling the pulse of its people, listening to the whispers of the past and the echoes of the mountains. He thought of the men who had fallen beside him, the peasants who had placed their trust in them, and the ideals that had driven him across continents. He felt a profound sorrow at the realization that his path would diverge from Fidel's, but also a burning resolve. The revolution was larger than any single leader, larger than friendship, larger than fear. Preparations for departure were quiet, deliberate, and fraught with tension. Che could not announce his decision publicly, for it would be seen as betrayal, a fracture in the revolution's facade. He began to arrange his next steps clandestinely, speaking only with trusted allies, outlining missions abroad that would allow him to continue the fight for global justice while maintaining his personal integrity. Every conversation was a careful balance between disclosure and secrecy, every word measured against the potential for misunderstanding, suspicion, or reprisal. The emotional toll was immense. Che wrote letters to comrades he would leave behind, letters filled with both encouragement and caution. He visited Havana's neighborhoods one last time, walking among the people whose lives had been touched by the revolution, seeing their hope mirrored in their eyes. And as he walked, he felt the quiet ache of leaving, the bittersweet recognition that his love for the revolution was bound to his conscience, not to the man who now wielded its power. One night, in a dimly lit room, Che sat with his journal open, pen trembling in his hand. He wrote of loyalty, betrayal, and principle, of the tension between friendship and morality. He wrote of the inevitability of change, of the need to preserve the revolution's integrity even at personal cost. "I cannot remain where my presence condones compromises I cannot accept," he wrote. "I leave not from disloyalty to Fidel, but from loyalty to the ideals that carried us through fire and blood. History will judge the revolution, and I must ensure that its soul remains unbroken." The decision, once made, brought a strange mixture of relief and grief. Che felt unburdened, yet hollow, as if a part of himself, the part that had shared countless victories with Fidel, was being left behind. The brotherhood they had forged in the mountains, the laughter, the fire, the shared struggle, was now shadowed by the quiet understanding that paths were diverging. He knew that the act of leaving could be seen as betrayal, but he also knew that true loyalty sometimes required distance, that principles must remain inviolate even when hearts are torn. The night before departure, Che met Fidel privately. The conversation was short, careful, yet heavy with unspoken understanding. Fidel spoke of trust, of responsibility, of the need to continue building Cuba, while Che listened, nodding, feeling the weight of history pressing upon them both. No accusations were made, no harsh words exchanged, only the quiet acknowledgement that two brothers in arms were about to step onto different paths. In the shadows of that room, Che felt both sorrow and resolve, mourning the end of one chapter while steeling himself for the battles yet to come. And so, with a small pack and a heart both heavy and resolute, Ernesto Che Guevara prepared to leave Cuba. The mountains of the Sierra Maestra, the streets of Havana, the faces of comrades and people alike, would remain etched in his memory forever. Yet the journey now called him elsewhere, toward new struggles, new countries, and the unyielding pursuit of revolutionary ideals. He knew that leaving was both an act of courage and an act of faith. Faith in the principles that had guided him, and courage to face a world where loyalty and friendship could never outweigh conscience. Che stepped into the night, feeling the cool wind against his face, carrying the faint scent of salt and earth. He took a deep breath, sensing both loss and liberation, the quiet certainty of a man who had chosen principle over comfort, ideals over ease, and the revolution over personal allegiance. The turning point had arrived, and with it, the first step toward a destiny that would span continents, challenge armies, and leave an indelible mark on history. The tropical air of the Congo was heavy with humidity, and Ernesto Che Guevara felt it cling to his skin like a second layer, oppressive and unrelenting. The forest stretched endlessly, a dense labyrinth of green that both concealed and threatened. Che had arrived with a small band of revolutionaries, dispatched from Cuba to assist local insurgents, carrying ideals that had been forged in mountains and battles far from this land. Yet even as he stepped into the jungle, the exhilarating certainty of the Sierra Maestra seemed distant, a memory, almost a dream, overshadowed by the stark reality of the world beyond Cuba. The locals were wary. They had endured colonial oppression, exploitation, and betrayal, and now foreign revolutionaries appeared, speaking of solidarity, justice, and liberation. Che, tall and intense, met their eyes with earnest conviction, trying to convey the sincerity that had carried him across continents. Yet he quickly realized that ideals alone were insufficient. Language, culture, distrust, and fear formed walls that could not be breached by words or even shared suffering. His presence was both a beacon and a reminder. Help had arrived, yet it was imperfect, foreign, and precarious. The battles that followed were chaotic and unforgiving. Terrain that had seemed navigable in maps became treacherous in practice. Rivers ran swift, forests tangled, and disease lurked in every shadow. Che moved with the precision of a man hardened by combat, but the jungle tested him in ways the mountains never had. Supply lines faltered, alliances broke down, and morale slipped like sand through his fingers. Every day he confronted the truth. Revolutionary ideals, when transplanted into unfamiliar soil, faced obstacles as lethal as any bullet. Yet even amid the frustration, Che observed moments of human resilience. Young men and women who had suffered unimaginable hardships fought with courage and determination, inspired not only by his presence but by the shared vision of justice. He trained, advised, and sometimes carried the wounded himself, feeling a strange blend of pride and despair. For every small victory, an ambush successfully executed, a village defended, there were equal or greater failures. Lost lives, broken trust, and the slow erosion of hope. Che's journal became a lifeline, a place to record victories, frustrations, and reflections. The revolution is never a linear path, he wrote one evening, exhausted, sweat streaking the dirt on his face. We carry ideals as torches through darkness, but the shadows are relentless. The people we fight for often do not recognize us, the allies we trust falter, and the enemy is both visible and invisible. Yet we endure because endurance is the essence of the struggle, and conviction is the only true compass. Isolation became one of Che's harshest adversaries. In Cuba he had known camaraderie, a brotherhood forged in blood and battle. Here the bonds were fragile, built on tenuous alliances, strained by cultural divides and conflicting priorities. He often found himself alone in thought, walking through the forest at dawn or dusk, reflecting on the choices that had brought him here. Loyalty, he realized, was tested not only by betrayal but by distance, by the impossibility of controlling outcomes beyond one's own hands. Fever and illness stalked the guerrillas relentlessly. Che saw men weakened by malaria and dysentery, their strength sapped as quickly as their morale. Supplies were scarce, communication with local groups sporadic, and the cacophony of chaos often seemed louder than any rallying cry of ideals. In those moments, Che confronted the harsh truth of revolutionary work abroad. It was not enough to fight for justice. One had to adapt to realities that were unyielding, unpredictable, and often cruel. Amid the despair, Che's leadership shone. His presence, decisiveness, and unwavering conviction inspired the fighters, creating cohesion where there had been fragmentation. He led patrols, planned strategies, and made decisions under pressure that often meant life or death. Yet even as he asserted authority, he remained painfully aware of the limits of control, of the fragile human threads holding together a mission that teetered constantly on the brink of collapse. The experience in Congo left Che profoundly changed. He realized that revolution was not only about ideology or victory, it was about adaptability, understanding, and humility. The mistakes, the miscalculations, and the cultural misunderstandings burned into him a lesson that no textbook or prior battle could have taught. The revolution he had carried with him from Cuba was alive, but it required constant vigilance, a willingness to learn, and an acceptance that failure was an inevitable companion of courage. After months of struggle, Che made the painful decision to withdraw. The mission, despite all effort, had faltered. The dream of uniting local insurgents under a shared revolutionary banner had collapsed under the weight of mistrust, miscommunication, and harsh realities. Che left the Congo with heavy heart and a renewed sense of purpose. If revolution was to succeed, it required more than ideals. It demanded strategy, cultural understanding, and the ability to inspire unity across boundaries. As he departed, Che reflected on the journey ahead. Bolivia awaited, a country steeped in injustice, ripe for change, yet as challenging and treacherous as the Congo. He carried with him the lessons of failure, the resilience of the human spirit, and the unyielding fire that had driven him from Argentina to Mexico, from the Sierra Maestra to Havana, and now across continents. The revolution was no longer a local struggle, it was global, yet increasingly personal, testing not only his leadership but his convictions, his morality, and his resolve. Che understood the stakes. The fight would not be measured in territory alone, but in ideals preserved, loyalty earned, and humanity protected. The guerrilla abroad was not merely a soldier in foreign lands. He was the embodiment of a principle, a witness to the suffering of others, and a custodian of a revolutionary spirit that refused to yield. And as he stepped onto the plane leaving the Congo, he carried the quiet certainty that the path ahead would demand everything: courage, cunning, endurance, and above all, unwavering commitment to the ideals that had carried him from the very beginning. The Bolivian mountains rose jagged and unforgiving, a stark mirror of the challenge that awaited Ernesto Che Guevara. The air was thin, crisp, and bitterly cold, each breath a reminder of the harsh reality in which revolution would be tested to its limits. Che had arrived with a small band of committed guerrillas, weary yet resolute, carrying the fire of ideals that had once ignited mountains and cities alike. But Bolivia was different: hostile terrain, minimal support from locals, and an army trained and armed to crush insurgents left no room for error, no margin for compromise. From the first days, isolation weighed heavily. Unlike Cuba or even the Congo, Che found himself in a country suspicious of outsiders, where peasants feared reprisal for aiding rebels and alliances were tenuous at best. Communication with potential supporters was sporadic, and betrayal lingered in the air, unseen yet palpable. Che moved through the rugged hills with a keen awareness that every shadow could conceal an enemy, every step could be the last. The fire of ideals burned brightly, yet it was tempered by the cold knowledge that conviction alone could not secure survival. Engagements with Bolivian troops were brutal and disorienting. Ambushes erupted suddenly from the dense undergrowth, bullets whistled through trees, and the jungle seemed to conspire against them. Che fought with precision, every decision weighted with responsibility, not just for his own life, but for the men who had trusted him, who had followed him across mountains, rivers, and continents. Each encounter carried the raw intensity of life and death, and the shadow of betrayal, both real and imagined, hovered over every campfire discussion, every whispered plan. Che's leadership was undeniable. He inspired courage, discipline, and endurance in the face of near-impossible odds. Yet even as he pressed forward, the cracks widened. Allies disappeared, some to fear, others to defection. Trust, the bedrock of every victory he had achieved, became a fragile veneer, easily shattered by exhaustion, hunger, or betrayal. Che sensed the loneliness of command acutely. He was no longer only a revolutionary but the embodiment of the ideals he had championed, and the weight of responsibility was suffocating. The guerrilla group moved cautiously through the valleys, setting ambushes, gathering intelligence and evading capture. Yet the Bolivian army, aided by the CIA and informed by local intelligence, was relentless. Che witnessed comrades fall, their lives extinguished in the flash of bullets or the roar of gunfire. The human cost of revolutionary zeal became painfully tangible. He pressed on, driven by conviction, yet the fire that had once seemed invincible now flickered with fatigue, frustration, and the heavy shadow of inevitability. Weeks of survival and struggle culminated in a fateful encounter near the village of La Higuera. Betrayal, always a whisper in the wind, had become a tangible force. Bolivian troops, guided by informants, closed in. Che and his men fought with ferocity, but the odds were insurmountable. One by one the guerrillas fell or fled, leaving Che isolated amid the jagged hills, his strength tested as never before. In the chaos, he moved with the calm precision of a soldier, aware that his time might be limited, yet determined to face it with dignity and conviction. Captured, wounded, and exhausted, Che faced his final hours with a clarity that few could comprehend. The fire of revolutionary zeal burned even as the body faltered, an unwavering commitment to the ideals that had carried him across continents. He was surrounded by soldiers, but in his mind he traversed the mountains, jungles, and streets that had shaped his journey. He thought of Fidel, of Cuba, of the comrades who had stood beside him, and of the countless innocents whose lives had inspired every choice he had made. The execution that followed was swift, clinical, and devoid of ceremony. Che faced it with the same resolve that had characterized his life. Unwavering, unbroken, a testament to the principles that had guided him through fire and blood. In his final moments there was no fear, only a fierce clarity, that the revolution was larger than any man, larger than loyalty or friendship, and that ideals, once ignited, could never be fully extinguished. Even in death, Che's presence endured. His life became a symbol, a fire carried forward by others who would continue the struggle, inspired by his courage, his unyielding commitment to justice, and the moral clarity that had guided him across mountains, continents, and battlefields. The rebellion in Bolivia had failed tactically, yet the spirit of the revolution remained indomitable, a force that transcended geography, politics, and mortality. In the quiet aftermath, the jagged peaks and silent valleys bore witness to the cost of uncompromising ideals. Che's name echoed in whispered stories, carried in songs, and immortalized in photographs and murals. The last battle was not only fought with bullets and strategy, but with moral conviction, the courage to act, the refusal to betray principle, and the unwavering belief that a better world was worth every sacrifice. Ernesto Che Guevara, the guerrilla abroad, the revolutionary idealist, the brother-in-arms, had reached the culmination of his journey. The mountains of Bolivia, harsh and unyielding, became his final stage, a place where courage, conviction, and the cost of ideals were laid bare. His life, marked by victories and failures, triumphs and betrayals, became a testament to the enduring tension between loyalty and principle, ambition and morality, friendship and revolution. Even as the world moved on, the fire he had carried refused to die. Che's life and death became a symbol of revolutionary zeal, a warning of the dangers of power and the fragility of loyalty, and a beacon for all who would dare to fight for justice against overwhelming odds. The last battle had ended, yet the revolution, both in spirit and in principle, continued, echoing across continents, inspiring hearts and challenging future generations to confront injustice, uphold ideals, and navigate the complex terrain of morality and power. The mountains of Bolivia fell silent after Ernesto Che Guevara's final battle. The air, once filled with gunfire, sweat, and fear, now carried only the whispers of wind through jagged peaks and valleys. Yet even in death, Che's presence remained, a symbol, a spark, a legend that refused to fade. The life of a man who had traversed continents, battled regimes, and sacrificed comrades and comfort for ideals became larger than life. His story whispered, sung, and painted across the world. Che's comrades carried the news back to Cuba with solemn reverence. Fidel, triumphant yet wary, received it with measured grief. There was mourning, yes, but also recognition of the choices that had led Che beyond Cuba, into struggles that were perilous, isolating, and morally complex. Fidel's response was political, strategic, but Che's absence left a human void, a brother-in-arms missing from the battlefield and from the heart of the revolution. The public narrative was carefully managed, portraying Che as a hero, a martyr, an emblem of unwavering courage. Yet those who knew him intimately, the ones who had bled alongside him in the Sierra Maestra, felt the quiet ache of personal loss, the gap left by a man whose ideals had guided them and whose absence now echoed like a hollow note in the corridors of history. Globally, Che's name became synonymous with revolution. Posters, photographs, and murals immortalized his image. The beret, the gaze, the steely resolve frozen in time. He was celebrated and mythologized, admired for courage, conviction, and the audacity to act. Students, insurgents, and idealists around the world drew inspiration from his life, seeing in him a model of steadfast principle and uncompromising action. His journey from Argentina to Mexico, Cuba, Congo, and Bolivia transcended geography, becoming a template for global rebellion, a symbol of the relentless pursuit of justice. Yet the legend was not without tension. To some, Che represented hope, moral clarity, and revolutionary zeal. To others, he embodied defiance, danger, and the uncompromising nature of radical action. His life raised questions that lingered long after his death. Could ideals survive without compromise? Could a revolutionary remain true to principle in the face of practical realities? How does loyalty intersect with ambition, and at what point does friendship bend under the weight of ideology? These were not easily answered, and they ensured that Che's story remained complex, alive, and profoundly human. In Cuba, his absence was felt in the quiet of command meetings, the conversations among revolutionaries, and the reflective moments of those who had followed him through mountains and jungles. Fidel continued to lead, consolidating power and shaping the nation according to his vision, yet the shadow of Che remained, a reminder of the ideals that had once driven them both and of the subtle tensions between loyalty and principle. Che's decisions, particularly his choice to leave Cuba, were understood in retrospect as acts of moral courage, a testament to a revolutionary who prioritized ideals over personal allegiance, even when doing so isolated him from allies and friends. Che's writings and reflections became a cornerstone of his legacy. His journals, letters, and speeches revealed a mind wrestling with the tension between morality and pragmatism, ambition and principle, loyalty and justice. They captured the essence of a revolutionary who understood that true change was neither simple nor safe, that the pursuit of justice demanded sacrifices that were often personal, and that leadership required not only strategy but unwavering moral clarity. Scholars, activists, and future revolutionaries studied his words, drawing lessons from both his successes and his failures. His life inspired films, books, songs, and debates that spanned decades and continents. The world grappled with the duality of the man, both hero and flawed human being, both idealist and strategist, both savior and martyr. Che became a canvas onto which societies projected their hopes, fears, and questions about justice, morality, and the power of individuals to shape history. Yet beneath the mythos lay the human reality, a man who had fought, loved, lost, and endured, whose every choice had been marked by conscience, courage, and relentless dedication to ideals. Even now, generations later, Che's story resonates in the quiet and in the roar. In Latin America, Africa, and beyond, revolutionaries look to his life as a testament to the cost and necessity of action, the courage required to pursue justice, and the endurance demanded by ideals. His journey through mountains, jungles, and cities, across victories and failures, serves as both inspiration and cautionary tale. It reminds the world that revolution is as much an internal struggle as it is an external one, that loyalty and friendship are tested by power, and that true leadership is measured not by authority, but by fidelity to principle. And so, Ernesto Che Guevara became more than a man. He became a symbol, an enduring flame. His life, though finite, ignited movements, conversations, and struggles far beyond his own existence. The ideals he carried, justice, equality, courage, and moral clarity, persisted in the hearts of those inspired by his journey. His story, with all its victories, failures, loyalties, and betrayals, became a testament to the complex interplay between human ambition and principle, between brotherhood and conscience, and between the pursuit of ideals and the harsh realities of a world resistant to change. In the end, Che's legacy was not defined solely by the territories he fought for, the battles he won, or the revolutions he sparked. It was defined by the unwavering moral compass that guided him through every trial, the courage to act when others hesitated, and the refusal to compromise ideals even in the face of fear, isolation, and death. The revolution had consumed him, shaped him, and ultimately immortalized him, not as a perfect man, but as a human being whose life illuminated the enduring tension between ideals and reality, and whose legend would inspire generations yet to come.